Welcome back to The Perfect Storm. We have with us today a new guest who you might not have seen before. This is episode 2, and we're going to be talking about the coming economic collapse. Is that right, Justin?
Yeah, it's part Kyle. Hey, Kyle, and thank you to Caleb Williams, economics extraordinaire, that's joined us today to talk about this. This series is about these big things that are all funneling into one supercell. That's why we're using the concept of storm. We spoke last time about the politics, the rise of populism, and how that's overwhelming the globalists that have ruled the world for so long. Linked in with that is money, and boy, is there a doozy coming. So, Caleb, what's your claim to fame when it comes to money, mate?
Oh, look, I'm just going to preface that I'm not an economist. I have dabbled in a bit
I thought you were. No.
Have dabbled in a bit of economics, and I do enjoy trying to keep up to date with a bit of that. But I'm an accountant by trade, chartered accountant, and I work here at the South New South Wales Conference as the Chief Financial Officer.
And Kyle, we have to footnote this. Mm-hmm. Please don't take this as financial advice.
Yeah, no financial advice here.
But we are going to tell you what we do know, and please go and verify it. We're not making this up. We'll show you the data. And the data, you don't have to be Einstein in economics to know there's trouble coming. It's everywhere.
So let's maybe start then with debt. Let's have a look at debt. What's happening with the debt here? For the uninitiated, on this screen, there's a lot of really big numbers, like really big numbers that are hard to understand. So what does all this mean?
So if I can jump in here, every 100 days or so, 90 to 100 days, the United States government goes $1 trillion further into debt. That's as we speak here in, July of 2024. Every 100 days. Now, to get in your brain what a trillion is, because I haven't owned one of those. I should have been an accountant. But if you were able to get $1,000 note, which the US make, we don't make them in Australia, and you pushed $1,000 note tied against another one and another one and another one, and you make a pile of them, you can go for 110 kilometres with that pile of notes before you get to a trillion. $1,000 notes. That's a lot of money. And they're cracking that out at such a rate. I remember when Obama finished, they were at 11 trillion, their national debt. Now they're about to hit 35 trill. Wow.
It's such a massive increase. When I was looking at this debt clock that Kyle brought up, I just didn't realise the enormity just across nations that we would consider as quite well developed to having such extraordinary debts. Like you just have to have a look at Japan, one of the most advanced economies in the world is 300% of GDP. So their debt is 3 times the amount that their total economy produces in 1 year. That's wild.
Again, I've heard it said that if you get to 100%, you're in serious jeopardy. You may not be able to come back. Australia's at about 66% at the moment, 66.9. Will soon be at 70. But if you get to 100, the coming back from that is not really been achieved in history. So, and the US debt, get this, Kyle, that's not including what they'll have to pay out in Social Security, which is their pension and all those other things that if you actually, what they do still have to pay out, they're obliged to pay, it puts it way off the Richter scale, and it's already bad. Caleb, what's so bad about debt? Who cares about a bit of debt?
And more than that, I would say, who cares about America's debt? How does that affect us? How does Australia here compare with the USA? Caleb, over to you, expert.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle and Justin. I think just to begin with the debt issue, debt necessarily isn't the worst thing in the world to have. Like, we often use debt to create new types of industry and other things. Like, even if you look in your personal life, you can use debt to help get yourself ahead into assets that essentially appreciate over time. The issue with this kind of debt, and there's a few different levels, but just focus on one to begin with, and that's this starts to become a larger burden on, like, particularly if we just look at the US, on their interest bill. Currently, nearly a third of their budget, their annual budget, is interest repayments, which means that that's pretty difficult to pay for other things unless you're increasing taxes. And they've actually, over the last 10 years, they've actually decreased taxes. And so the money's got to come from somewhere. So are they just borrowing more money to pay for interest?
I just want to salute all our friends in Victoria today. God bless you guys down there. Kept voting for Dan, didn't you? Anyway, ambulances, they're not working so well anymore. And hospitals, we can't afford any more nurses and doctors. Man, you know, America's big spend every year, it's about 800 to 900 billion on military. 2024, their biggest spend is repayments, the interest repayments on this debt that they have just can't. They're addicted to it. They're addicted. And there's only one way for a junkie to get off that.
Can I ask a dumb question?
Yep.
Who are they borrowing the money from? Who do they owe the debt to?
Well, that leads us to the bond market, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the bond market, essentially the bond markets existed for a long time, and the world generally looks to the US bond market, and the reason that that is because they're the predominant currency that is in the world today. Now, Australia, for example, we issue bonds, but the predominant market is the US bond market. These bonds, the US essentially sell American dollars so that they have funds to be able to fund the budget. That's essentially, so they're selling money to other countries, to other people. Anyone has access to these bonds, and historically, the US dollar has been a strong currency, a safe currency, and somewhere where people know, well, they're not going to fail, you know. That's essentially been the premise and why people invest in US bonds.
They were always the best, weren't they? And we're going to put a pin in it because we want to talk about quantitative easing because that's been a nightmare. But the bond market's a normal way to raise debt. And, okay, Caleb, because, you know, most people are glazing over out there. Please don't glaze over, not just yet. This is going to affect you. It's going to affect your kids. It's going to affect everyone you know. Try and stay with us here. So you buy a bond from the US. Why would I buy a bond from them? What's it going to give me back?
Well, they essentially they're seen historically as a safe return.
I'm going to get interest on that.
So you get interest on that. You don't get any capital growth on that, which I think is a key point, but it's been seen historically as a safe investment. Whereas, you know that your money at the end of the day, at least you're going to get your money and your coupon interest rate back over the course of the bond. Now, that can't be said for all countries, and companies actually issue bonds as well, but the safest market has traditionally been these first world nations that issue bonds.
Okay, and let me set your hair on fire here for a minute, because everyone sort of, the stock market's up, the stock market's down. Let me tell you, and I lost my house in the GFC. I lived in the United States. It was worth, I put it on the market. I got called to come back to work in Australia from being a pastor in California. I put it on the market for $620,000, I think. GFC hit 3 weeks later. Took 2 years to sell it, and it sold. The bank we owed the money to had gone. We didn't even know who we owed the money to. It sold for $310, half its value. Pay attention, folks at home. I've lived through some of this. All of a sudden, I didn't pay much attention to the economy. All of a sudden, I pay attention. I pay real attention now. And what I've learned, Caleb, is more than the stock market, if you want to look at what's happening in the future, look at the bond market. The bond market on what people are doing. And there's some funny stuff going on in the bond market. This is the supercell forming. There's some big trouble coming, according to the bond market. What's the bond market doing, Caleb?
Look, the bond market at the moment, and this has only happened, minimal times in history. The bond yield has actually inversed. So 2-year bonds are worth more than what a bond is in 10 years' time.
So just folks, don't miss what was just shared with you. Easy to glaze over. Just say that again.
Yep. So the interest that you get off a 2-year bond is more than what you would get off a 10-year bond, and I think it's over 1%. So I think when I was looking this morning, 2-year bonds were about 5.5%, and the 10-year bond is around 4.3%.
And that's called an inverted yield.
Inverted yield curve. Yep.
That, folks, the glaze over, just pay attention to that. Forever since I was a kid, if you put your money in the bank and you say, I'm going to do a term deposit, it's going to have to stay in there for 2 years. You get a lot more interest than if I can take it out sooner. All of a sudden that is flipped because the world is super nervous about the US treasuries, the US bonds. And that's an indicator that we're coming to the end of a cycle here where we have spent like drunken sailors, and it's coming home to roost. Now, before we freak out completely, quantitative easing.
Yeah, so quantitative easing, and this is kind of another thing that you would lump into government borrowing and debt. And we first saw this new economic phenomena in 2008. And quantitative easing essentially is the printing of money. So you're essentially increasing the supply of money at a given point in time.
So what happened historically with currency? So the US famously was on the gold standard until 1975, I think August of 75.
Yeah, it's in
somewhere
70s.
around there.
Yeah.
They decided, might have been 73, but they took the US dollar. Always, if I had to create more money, I had to have more gold kept there at Fort Knox or wherever they kept it. So you knew that when you're using that dollar, it's only a piece of paper. What made it valuable? It was being backed by gold. And that would also stop a country borrowing like a drunken sailor, because as much gold as I can gather is how much money I can create. But now it started in 2008, and there's a wonderful book that I would recommend everyone to buy and read called The Lords of Easy Money, How the Federal Reserve Broke the American Economy. This book is essential if you want to understand the wealth transfer, everything that's gone on in our time. Quantitative easing, this guy beats it to pieces, explaining it, how it happened, who voted for it, and why they did it. They got interest rates to zero, and it still didn't help. What do we do next? QE1, they called it. And they got up to QE4, where these cycles of creating money out of thin air rather than having gold back it, we can just print currencies. Why is that a good thing or a bad thing, Caleb?
Well, look, I think it can be a good thing. I think what we've seen, though, is that it's because it hasn't been tested before, it creates further issues within the economy, particularly the amount of money that they've created essentially out of thin air as well. If you look back in history, you can see this happening in other parts. So you look at Germany post World War One, when they had to make payments to the Allies because they had inflicted on the war, and they essentially started to print money there, and it essentially become worthless. Another example where we've seen this happen to the point of being absolutely ridiculous was in Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe. He was printing money so that he could actually he was printing money for the government, but he was also printing money for himself so that he could afford all of these different things, military and whatever else. And they had an inflation rate of 1,000,000%, which is like, you think of that, you go in to buy a candy bar out of a store for, say, 300 million, whatever the currency was at the time, and then but they tell you, oh, it's now 400 million. And so you're like, oh, well, I better go to the ATM and get some more money out. You go and get your money, and by the time you've come to the store, they've put it up to 400 million, and you only got enough out for that.
Buy that fast, that candy bar. You run to the shop when you get the money of that. Now, that's an extreme example, but in that book, The Lords of Easy Money, the main character he talks about, who was on the reserve at the time, had a $500,000 Deutschmark note that in 1921 could buy a house. In 1923, a loaf of bread, same currency.
Yep.
That's how much it devalued when they started to print. And don't panic just yet, folks. There's a lot more playing out, but this is what they've decided to do. And the result of creating more money creates an incredible bubble. It created for us a transfer of wealth like the world had never seen. And folks listening to this, you probably don't know that you've lived through the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. You lived through it. And when I was in the States and my house lost it, the banks that we lost the money to were bailed out by Barack Obama's federal government. And they got rich. And they caused the problem. And the little guy, you may notice that you go to the shop now and you just say, Caleb, you're on a trip. You're going out to preach in Mudgee. I was just in Mudgee. Hello, Mudgee. You stop to buy a packet of lollies in the shop to keep you awake. They used to be $2 and now they're $7.
Yep.
That's literally what's happening. Inflation is making everyone poor.
Yep.
The hidden tax.
And particularly it's making the most vulnerable even poorer than what they were before, because a lot of wealthy people, like their percentage of cash that they hold on hand compared to their other assets, their intrinsic assets, is minute compared to what we, the middle class and lower class, would have to hold. And so because we're holding a greater portion of funds in cash, it's actually detrimental to us because we don't have the ability to hold it in these other things, shares and property and that kind of thing, that aren't as affected by this inflation phenomena. And we're going to see this, in not too distance.
You want to put Kyle to put the graph up of, because how this quantitative easing worked, and the book makes it really clear that they don't literally have a photocopier knocking the dollars out. They go to a keyboard and they create money and the reserve, and they send it out. This is talking US to 24 big banking and finance institutions, Lehman Brothers type places. And they just give them that with the condition that you have to invest this in the stock market or real estate.
Mm.
And folks, you may have noticed that your house price has gone up and up, and then kids coming out of school, they're thinking, how are we ever going to afford a house? I'll never get a deposit, let alone a house. And if I do get a house, I'm going to have $1 million something debt. that the interest rate goes up like we're living through right now. It's about to go up again, folks, I'd say. Here we go. Everyone's then under great duress just to have the Aussie dream. This is all happening, and the inflation bubble, or asset bubble is what I really should call it, of stocks and of real estate and land.
Yep.
Caleb, on the screen, what's this? And if you're listening on Faith FM, we will talk this through for you because you can't see the pictures.
Yep. So we've got two lines on this particular graph here. We've got one, the blue one, which is showing 10-year Treasury yield. So the Treasury yield essentially is just the interest rate on bonds. And then you have there the S&P 500 index. So the S&P 500 index is looking at the top 500 companies in the US
that are trading on the stock market.
Yeah, that are trading. So that's just a simple kind of analogy of that. And so what you can see here, this graph, you can see it starts around 1965 and goes through to where we are currently, 2024. And you can see the yellow line there is the S&P 500 index. And that really, you can see it starts to increase somewhat, minimally around 1985. And if you actually looked at the period between 1985 and 2000, it would be more pronounced if you just looked at that period. It's minimised because of what's happened in the last...
it's gone off the graph, basically. It goes off the page, folks, if we made it too small.
It's become exponential. But if you look at like kind of that 1985 to 2000 period, we can see quite a considerable increase there. Look, my assumption on that is that that's a similar time where credit become easier and the gold standard was dropped.
Oh, yeah, I see where you are. Okay.
So if you just looked at that part of the graph, it would look very similar to our last part of the graph if we didn't include from kind of 2008 onwards.
Yeah, and I apologise if you're listening on the radio and you can't see this graph. Where would people find it if they wanted to look at it?
So we're actually on YouTube as well. So Faith FM Australia, and this show will be broadcast
what a perfect
live
plug.
on Friday at 4:30. As you're listening to it right now on the radio, you can also watch it live on YouTube.
So here we get along to, let's say, 2008. Funny that date. What happened in 2008?
Well, that was the date that essentially we entered the global financial crisis, the fall of Lehman Brothers, which was the first large bank in the US to collapse. And then what you were talking about before, Justin, the US government actually bailed some of the larger banks from that point.
The cause of the problem was bailed out with taxpayers. This is why I'm not angry. They used taxpayers' money to bail out the blokes that caused the problem. Like fair dinkum. It's just horrendous. And what happens on this graph, these things follow each other until because they put interest rates to zero, still didn't fix the problem. Oh, quantitative easing.
Yeah, quantitative easing.
Printing money.
And that's from that point, roughly 2008. And it took them a while to do the QE, but you can really see it having a major effect on the US stock market. As you can see there,
they just diverge. For the folks on the radio, the two lines diverge in like a crocodile's mouth opening.
Yep.
They followed each other, they tracked each other, then all of a sudden this massive saltwater croc opens his mouth. And the stock market's gone through the roof and the bond market is just bouncing along like it has been.
Yep.
They are no longer linked together because someone has tampered with the natural forces of market forces, which according to the Austrian School of Economics, they're going to catch up to each other again. They're going to meet again.
Yep.
And I'm not sure, well, I am sure it won't be at the top.
Well, another thing that's interesting about this graph, you can see there the yield is actually continuing to decrease into 2020. And the only reason that it's spiking there between 2020 and 2025 today is because of COVID. And then I'll let you talk about it. But essentially, they started quantitative easing again.
The third cycle of it, I think.
Yeah.
QE3.
And so normally that would what we're seeing here in this graph is that we're actually seeing, the bond yields increase over that time. But that's where inflation has started to finally bite. Because this period from roughly 2008 through to 2020, we didn't have inflationary issues, but we are now starting to really see them. And they were kind of spurred on by certain conflicts around the world. But now it's pretty evident that, there's a lot to answer for relating to QE.
So this idea that, if we just put up interest rates a little bit, it'll stop inflation, it's actually been baked in a long way before now.
Yeah.
And what's caused it is the proliferation of cash into assets and stocks and land and everything that's fake money. It's not real. It's not linked to any productivity improvement like you'd expect. The Austrian School of Economics, old school. You want to increase it, you increase productivity, you do all that stuff. Sorry to bore you at home, folks, but this affects you when you go to the groceries. It's going to affect the price of your house.
Yeah, that's right, Justin. And one of the other things that I was thinking of when you were talking about, the items that the US budget is going towards, the significant items, interest on funds borrowed, and then the military, and then into social security, none of that actually adds to the economy.
It's just government
It
spend.
doesn't add to growth.
It's just big government.
Yeah.
Using taxpayers' money. And folks, if you're going to glaze over on me, just take a deep breath and glaze over for a minute, because I want to mention the Keynesian School of Economics, which we also call modern monetary theory. I love this stuff.
Can we make this part quick?
Can we make it quick? Caleb, do you want me to bash it or do you want to bash it?
You can bash it. I'll let you do some bashing.
The Keynesian School of Economics says basically modern monetary theory, if you've got a problem with Australia's got a big crisis, Kevin, 07, let's just give away money. Let's print money out of thin air. We have no national debt, so let's make some debt, which actually is not a bad theory because they went through the Great Depression where they tried austerity and it caused the Great Depression. So 1936, this dude comes along and says, let's do this new theory now. It's a theory. It's never really been practiced, but we've put it into practice. So when you're in trouble, don't be panicked. Just get more debt. Just print more money. Just create more money and get through it. But here we are. You think America in a normal should be smooth sailing relatively. We're not in a global conflict. We've got a few dust-ups going on. If you live in Ukraine, it's more than a dust-up, but sorry. But it's not anything out of what we've seen. And there's got to create $1 trillion every 100 days to keep the economy going. That's now become the crisis of creating money has become normal. What happens when we really do have a Fed income crisis, when China invades Taiwan and there's a big conflict and Australia can't trade with coal and everything? Oh, let's just print money. Hang on, we've done that. We've actually used all the levers that we have now.
Yep.
Let's put, Japan had interest rates in the negative. Yeah. I didn't know you could go negative with interest rates, but at one point, their interest rates went below zero into the negative.
Yep.
What does that even mean?
Well, they had a bit of an issue there where people were just hoarding their money away in the bank. So they had money, but they didn't want to invest
Spend
it
it.
anywhere, and so the
Smart
government
people.
was essentially paying to invest it in things. But the Keynesian, I do wonder with the Keynesian economics whether that was the original intent. I think it's gone further from the original intent because you were meant to have surpluses, and those surpluses were
Would
meant
pay
to
that
cover.
back. That's right.
Yeah, that's right. They were meant to
Yeah,
cover
that's being fair to
future
Keynesian.
issues.
Poor old Keynesian.
So I'll defend that one a
But-
tiny bit.
But what's happened, we're going through the crisis, and let's pick on COVID, where we had to, in Australia, we were bailed out. God bless them. We appreciated it at the time. Well, when is that going to stop, and when are we paying it all back? And the US is certainly, they didn't help their people as much as us because they've got structural debt like unbelievable. They're just, now the new normal is just spending and spending and spending. What's the long-term consequence of doing that? Because it's going to get faster and faster and faster, this consequence.
Well, I do worry in the US. See, where our national budget, so our government budget, it doesn't have the same kind of structural issues that the US budget has.
God bless mining.
Yeah, absolutely. Royalties and whatever else. And when I had a look at a 10-year projection of our budget, there was, there are issues, but it's not anything too dire. We're a growing nation as well, whereas the US has kind of started to plateau off a lot. The issues that I see, though, it can't continue forever. Like, there's a limit, and you kind of alluded to that. We've got all of these conflicts going on at the moment, and if the US wants any kind of part in that, they're going to have to spend money towards it, and I don't know where that's actually going to come from. The other big issue that I think it's really causing, and you alluded to this as well, was the fact that when the government did bail out, they didn't bail out mum and dad, they bailed out the banks.
The big end of town.
We've seen this big transfer of wealth, and I was talking to Justin before this started, saying that there needs to be a bit of a transfer of wealth from those ultra rich in the US.
Well, let's just talk about, just in our thing here, we'll just talk about solutions. Because I know what's going to happen, but I don't. I'm not God.
Yep.
The Bible's told us that there's some big corrections coming. But what you suggest, tell me, this would be an ideal way to fix this now, this transfer of wealth, this hoarding. James said in Scripture, you've hoarded wealth in the last days.
Yep.
And the guy that cuts your lawn, the labourer is crying out for his wages. This transfer of wealth, it's horrendous. And it was predicted in Scripture. A lot of people don't know that. It's in James. But tell me how you would, in an ideal world, how you would fix it.
Yeah, look, I'm no expert in tax policy or anything like that, but you can obviously see that there's structural issues with the US debt and structural issues with taxes, because the taxes that they're bringing in with aren't enough to cover what you were mentioning before, because they're borrowing $1 trillion every 100 days. One of the things that I would look at if it was me running the country would be looking at going, how can we actually get extra funds from, to cover this? And you can't be taxing the middle and lower class anymore, because they're already struggling with
They're the
things
ones
like
that have had it
inflation.
taken from them as it is.
That's right. They wouldn't be able to afford anything. And so really I think they should be looking at the big business, higher end in town. What are they actually paying? Looking at multinational corporations. A lot of these large corporations, essentially, they have companies located in other parts of the world, in tax havens, and so they're located in places like Ireland, and other various countries around the world that might have a tax rate of, say, 10% or 5%. And so what they do is they hold patents, like Apple, for example, hold patent elsewhere in other countries.
So they can get out of tax, basically.
And so essentially they're paying that entity a royalty for using their patent in the US to sell Apple products. And so they're just transferring that, essentially, my mind, they're transferring profits from the US to another country to avoid paying the amount of tax. And we've got this going on, and it's causing this distortion in the economy. If everyone just paid their fair share, including the upper end of town, I'm sure it would do a lot to alleviate budget pressures. It would, I would hope, also sort out. We're seeing a greater divide between rich and poor, and just like when I was in the US last year, I saw this. Like, the cost of things had doubled in 10 years since I went there 10 years prior, and I just couldn't believe that.
And wages haven't.
But wages haven't kept up, and they definitely at the lower levels they nowhere near keeping up, and it's just really hard to see that. And the amount of homeless people that I saw as well, like staggering.
Yeah. The Argentinian leader, the guy that's just been elected down there, is an economist. His way is just cutting the government services, just firing all the government officials, cutting the life out of the government and regulations, just deregulating everything. And he's actually turning things around. But this is bigger. This is global. The problem when inflation, if you don't kill inflation, it will kill you.
Yeah, and even if you're taking money off, more wealthy people, it wouldn't. We're going to have issues at the moment having this wealth distribution, because it will impact inflation. These wealthy people don't essentially need to spend any of their money.
No.
But it would be going to people that would be. So you're going to end up with similar issues. The one thing that you won't end up with is this huge government debt issue. You be able to slowly eat that away, which would improve the economy. I think another important thing to actually help would be improving productivity within the economy. But I just don't think I think that's a tough one.
Folks, and I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to tell you what I think is going to happen. Nearly always, they've had all these levers to control. It will be out of their control. A run will happen. There'll be an economic correction. It will always lead to a military conflict in history. They're pretty well linked anyway, like those two graphs that follow each other.
Yep.
This is such a dangerous place and a dangerous time we're living, because not only do we have the political machinations that have never been seen before, we have the economic, and we have a military build-up. And our next one next week, we're going to talk about that, because just today they've announced Australia's buying these fast attack drones. What do we need those for, folks? They can see the stuff coming, and it's coming, folks. Whether you believe me or whether you're ready, it's coming. This cannot go on forever. And if inflation turns into hyperinflation, you were talking about that earlier, where you're buying a chocolate in the shop, you have to run in there and do it quick, or you won't. You have to go back and get more money because it's a 1,000,000%. This thing called inflation, it feeds on itself. And they just announced in the government here in Australia, they're doing a wage increase to help with the cost of living. You hear all this cost of living. That's called inflation, folks. They're chasing it now, which I think is the wrong thing to do. And I'm not a politician, and that's just my personal opinion. They're chasing it.
Look, I was at an economic forum a few weeks ago, and that's essentially what the economist was saying there, was that we're at the point where the government probably didn't do enough in their budget to minimise inflation, and not to have austerity, but just to minimise the inflation, not add to inflation. But it looked like the budget was doing that. We've just recently had tax cuts, which will be interesting to see whether
Putting more money in the system.
it just puts more money in the economy. And
We like it because it's in my pocket first.
well, that's right. But where we've got to be careful, am I saving that extra money that I put into my pocket, or am I going, oh, I wouldn't mind having, another night out for dinner, or oh, I've got this money, I can actually spend it on some clothes that I need, on some discretionary items that I haven't been able to do because my mortgage repayments have gone up and the costs of other things have gone up as well. And I'm, having to, I can actually afford these other discretionary items that are somewhat important.
The dog's chasing its tail. Now, on our last little bit here, I want to talk about currency. And fiat currency, they declare it so fiat means they say this is red, yellow, whatever color. $20 note's red, isn't it? Should we put a $20 note up on the screen for people watching overseas? In Australia, we have coloured money, and it's plastic. It's the best money in the world. It's amazing stuff. Won't buy you the most, but we'll put up a $20. Oh, look at our colourful money. It is colourful. I love the colours of our money. So I don't see a lot of those green fellas, but the $20 note. So your currency is built on trust, and the government issues it and it says this is $5, and then I can go and take that $5 and buy something of value and trade in that. I gave them my labour or whatever I did to get the currency, and they give me that, and then that's how our whole economy works. Currency seems to me to be in a lot of jeopardy moving forward because of the behaviours of this big end of town and this transfer of wealth and the inflation. What's the danger for currency in this environment, Caleb?
Well, I think if you have a look at interest rates, like if we look at the last 12 months, what the most that you're probably getting on a term deposit is that for maybe 4.5%, but we've seen inflation at 7%, and yes, it has been declining in recent times, but essentially last year inflation would have been around the 7%. You might be able to have a term deposit at the 4.5%. Your money is still losing value at that 4.5% interest
because of inflation and the cost of everything. And so having cash was always the goal. Have lots of cash in the bank. But right now, if you're cashed up, you're going backwards because assets are increasing at a greater rate.
Yep. And we've just seen that like in the Australian housing market, and I can't believe that it's still so strong. We've seen it in our own stock exchange here. That's increased quite substantially. Even if you look at the peak of 2019 or the start of 2020 and compare it today, it's much higher. And then I think we've also got to have a bit of a look at these other currencies, the digital currencies that have come out. Most notable, Bitcoin, big one. And yes, it's become popular, but it's become even more popular since COVID and since quantitative easing. And we've just seen it. Interesting, the articles coming out, at the start, say 2020, 2019, when Bitcoin was starting to increase and everyone's dissing it and going, oh, no,
I
this
remember
isn't
it
going
was
to
$5.
last.
It was $5, 2011.
And there you go. But what's interesting about it, it has been very volatile, but it stayed the last little while. It stayed quite high. It didn't dip down.
And that's a reflection of what people think about our existing currencies, I think.
Yeah, I and I can't say that for sure, but I have this feeling, particularly when you see gold. Now, Bitcoin's a bit different to cash. Its inflation rate is now becoming lower and lower and lower. And by about, I think it might be, 2100, there won't be any inflation with Bitcoin because there's only ever
They've
21 million
They're
or
not gonna
21
print
billion
more.
bitcoins. That's
They're not-
right.
That's,
they can't.
That's a great advantage. And that's like gold. You have to go and dig it out of the ground somewhere. You have to find some. It's really hard to find. And so it's always restricted. And that's why it's a great currency.
That's right. It has a pretty low inflation rate as well. Gold does. And Bitcoin will actually be at a lower value at some point in time as well, which is just really interesting.
I hate the digital side of the government can just not only track everything you do, but control.
Yep.
Because it's digital.
And it's interesting that technology, the blockchain chain technology, it's tracked over time. Now,
Constantly.
Bitcoin's a bit different because it's not a government-run thing, but that is something that the government could do. And I think they've started to introduce these digital currencies elsewhere to compete with Bitcoin. But I wonder if there's another alternative motor there.
Well,
in
the few minutes we've got left, there's some scriptures that I'd want to bring to this discussion, and that's in Revelation chapter 13. If you think the economy doesn't matter, it's not going to feature. In Revelation chapter 13, when the mark of the beast is declared by the lamb-like beast, and we're going to do a program on that, Kyle, aren't we? Identifying that lamb-like beast because it's a real beast. It's a king or a kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
At the end, it says that no one could buy and sell except they received the mark. So economic sanctions, economic coercion actually plays a real thing at the end of time. And if it's digital, if you've got some cash under your bed and you go, no one knows what you spend it on.
Well, even now, like the bank can freeze money in your account, and the government has powers. The ATO definitely has certain powers there as well. So it's
Justin Trudeau, famously in Canada, when the truckers were protesting, and he was getting embarrassed the way he decided to try and end it. He froze all the truckers' bank accounts. They can do that to us today. We don't have to wait for digital currency to be introduced. They can lock up your bank account today unless you've got cash somewhere. And I don't think they like cash. I think that's...
well, that's another thing that, another story. But even here in Canberra, there's nowhere near as many places that will be accepting of cash after COVID. And so... that's just something that I've been noticing as well. Cash is accepted at a lot less places.
$7.8 million frozen in 200 bank accounts under emergency powers meant to end protests in Ottawa.
Yeah, that shows you they all do. What Revelation 13 is speaking about has already happened.
The laws are already in place. They're just not using them as much as they need to.
No. And folks, this is in the context. In Revelation chapter 18, it says in 1 hour, the Babylon and all the merchants of the earth, their wealth has come to nothing. And we're living in such extreme times. There's extremity in politics, there's extremity in economy, the military side, the technology and the AI, the way the Christian church is acting towards taking control of nations and governments through elections. This is all getting so extreme. We're living at the business end of history. And if you think that, you're safe because you've put your trust in wealth, Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy, don't put your trust in wealth, but in the living God. Wealth can be so fickle. It can be gone in a moment. It's like your health. One accident away from not having good health and one diagnosis away. We want to offer a book to those that are watching today or listening. And the way they get hold of this book, Kyle.
The way you get hold of the book is called The Great Controversy, specifically the Global War on Freedom, which is essentially what we're talking about, right? The storm is coming. There's a war on your freedom, and that's a spiritual war as well. And this book covers not only the history of times past, but the future of what's to come.
And I've got to say that this book, it's been one of the biggest selling books in the history of book selling. It's all history up until around 1900. and from there on, it's predictive.
Mm.
So it's recounting how God's acted in history since Jesus' time, since the destruction of Jerusalem, right forward through the Reformation, through the modern era, and we get to about 1900, and this is when it was first released. Then it goes to the end of time. It'll blow your mind. I jumped straight to the end of this book. It will blow your mind what was predicted in this book.
So the way to get that book then is to text the word STORM, that's STORM, to 0482 082 876. So that's a simple text message, the word STORM, because our show is called The Perfect Storm. So maybe you'll remember that. Okay. 0482 082 876. When you text that, it'll just get your name, your address. And here's the special thing that we do with books is we don't trust Australia Post to get them to you because one day they'll stop delivering our packages. So we're going to start now and deliver them by hand. Yeah. So we'll send somebody to your door to give you that book personally to make sure you get it.
We have a bunch of young people that want to do something, so we get them active and doing that. So that'll be good. So Caleb, we're going to summarize. We're living in a time where the end of the party's almost here, it seems to me. The excesses of avoiding. There's a correction. 08, I should have let it crash in Justin's opinion. Now, it's easy for me to say. I probably would have lost everything, but I did anyway. So they bailed the big end and they printed money, which was in effect stealing from the poor or the working class.
And kind of stealing from the future as well.
And our children. That debt, that people can go into their grave in their 80s and they've accrued all this debt. They don't have to worry. But what about our children and our grandchildren and what they have to do? This is an unsustainable place in which we live, and it's just another indicator to me. There's supercells forming, the politics, the economics of all this, and now here comes the military. And Australia has never spent more money since the Second World War to now on military. What do our leaders know that they're doing this big spend? Why are we buying fast attack drones? Why are we getting all these military equipment built here and we want nuclear subs and we want the long-range missiles, a missile defense system? Stuff's going on, and you might just think, I don't want to know about this. I want to put my head in the sand. That's okay, but I want to know because I've been bitten before, and I'm excited because what the Bible says is coming to pass. And I want you to be ready, and you need to be ready spiritually. So keep listening in. The Perfect Storm. That's episode 2. Thank you, Caleb.
Now sorry, Caleb.
Oh, I was just going to say not a problem and happy to be here.
It's like a naturalness. He looks smart with his glasses too.
I think he looks smarter in the studio than he looks in his office, actually.
Oh, look, that's probably not too far from the truth.
Good on you, Caleb.
So The Perfect Storm, we're going to be live-ish every Friday, 4:30, and it'll be live on YouTube at the same time. If you ever miss an episode or you're listening at a different time, you can go back to the YouTube channel, watch it again, and if you're on YouTube watching this, you can listen on Faith FM, which is 87.6 usually, and I think it's 87.0 and 87.7.
Just go to the app, Faith FM, on any of your listener apps.
So,
God bless you, folks. Thank you for listening. We look forward to seeing you next time.